それでは次に OECD のヒューベルタス・ガイ博士に Oecd-Fao 農業アウトルックの主要なメッセージについてご講演をいただきます。
Thank you. At the moment, my video is not coming. Yeah, now I can start my video. Oops. Okay. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And it's great to have such an outreach and such an attention to this webinar, interest from all over Japan. As Holger already started, we separated the presentation of our of the joint outlook between OECD and FAO. So Holger presented somehow what is behind and started with production and consumption to show the main driver. And actually my work now, it's a bit easier. I just have to put the things together, where happens production and consumption and how it's driven, what does it mean? And I think we can go to my presentation and then going on the second slide. So there are two main elements which actually balance it. Next one. The one element is trade. So actually production and consumption growth don't happen at the same place. And there are other reasons to bring it together in trade. The second one is actually looking at prices, because prices are important to drive both consumption and production growth and bring it together to balance it. That in the end, we have equal quantities produced and consumed. And then I will speak a bit about the uncertainties and the messages we can derive out of the whole work we have done. Next slide. Next one. So we are speaking now about trade. And this is, we started with this message actually last year when we looked at it, and actually from the calories you consume roughly around the globe, a fifth or 20% have crossed the border. So, and that's quite equal around the globe. There are some exceptions, but generally you can think about that a fifth of the calorie you consume have crossed the border. You see it's much higher in North Africa and Near East, as the production potential is lower there. The opposite is a bit for North America. There are a traditional surplus region, and also the countries are very large. So they have a wide diversity within their production bases that also influence how much is imported when you have also diversity in. And the trade is not only happening within different products which you cannot produce, but also within product groups, because some countries really want to have variety. You see it very often in things like cheese trade, because people prefer different type of cheeses which come from different regions. So actually it is treated as a commodity in our sense, but people prefer diversity and look at different types of cheese. Next slide. And the intensity of trade, how much is traded, is actually it's different between different products. So we had this 20% roughly as the average, but when you look at the different products we are covering, some are really traded a lot, and especially the milk powders, but they are actually to an extent produced that they can be traded, because it's so difficult to trade liquid milk. So actually the powders are often produced that you can actually trade dairy products. That's why they have a very high trade share. When you would put milk in itself, it would be at the other end. So the whole dairy, from dairy production, is only 8% which is traded, but that is then majority made as powder or as cheese and butter. And then also quite high is soybeans, because the feed, and especially feed imports previously, especially from Europe, but now more, now the dominant is China. When they have not sufficient production base, the first element they import is more the feed, and then it's especially soybeans, because that has high protein, it's limited production potential, so that's more traded. On the other hand, you see very often staples like roots and tubers and rice, where countries are really use what is locally produced as a basis of diets. So, and that's why they are traditionally not so much traded, those products. And then you have products which are very sensitive because of hygiene and other reasons which are slow. So, and the development is generally slightly increasing, but you see different developments for different products. So some products are continue to increase, some are a bit declining, especially we see it with biofuels, where it's much more domestic issue now and less in trade, biodiesel in the middle. So there is a different development. And when we look at the next slide, there you see actually that regions are also changing. So it's actually, they are specializing more. You see that the Americas are traditionally and growing strong exporters. There's stronger growth in Latin America than in North America. And then you have, on the other hand, the importing regions. You see the big jump in the last 10 years of Asia Pacific, which was really fueled with increasing imports of feed and other material into China. You see also strong growth in imports in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Middle East and North Africa. On the other hand, you see the switch in Europe and Central Asia, which is actually the keeping up pace and growing exports of cereals from Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, which are actually producing more surplus. And in addition, also in Europe is quite low population growth. So the growth in demand and also saturation of overall demand allows that more is exported and less needs to be imported. Next slide. Looking at importing countries. So this slide is a bit confusing at the first sight, but it's simply an illustration to see which are the biggest importers. And the concentration on the importer side is not as big as on the exporter side, but you see some dominant countries. You see very often China there. You see also Japan and several places, especially for meat, a bit for dairy. You see also in cereals, China is a considerable importer of agricultural goods, so it's important to look what happens. The markets are open and products are available to fill the somehow demand gap in Japan. And other countries are also dominating, but for different products. You see for oilseeds, the EU is quite considerable, and you see very often also regions in North Africa, Middle East, which are a strong importer of products. Going to the other side, next slide. The exporter side, the concentration is much higher. Almost for all products, more than 70% of the exports are coming from 5 countries or regions. Mostly it's here really single countries. It's not so many regions in our aggregates here. And you see the exports are coming mostly from the Americas. You have also for meat and dairy, often then Australia and New Zealand as exporters. And then, yeah, it's a different country mix than the importers, as you see also in the color of the flags, much more blue here, much more red on the other side. And getting to the next one, and that also shows that for some countries, next one, please. It is very important to have access to markets and to be a big exporter of products. And you see some countries here which actually more than a quarter of their agriculture products are exported. And some are concentrated of singular products which they export. So they really concentrate of specific elements. For example, Norway, it's only fish, and they are actually an importer of other products, but because of the big exports of fish, they appear here because it's such a volume of product which is exported. And others are the traditional exporter like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which appear here. Paraguay is also joining the group. And then Brazil, because of the size, it's really considered that 25% of the products are exported. Next slide. Getting from trade to prices. So everything comes together, exports, imports, production, consumption, and to get prices to balance it. Next slide. You have this long run slide of real prices. And you see it's a decline over the time, but it's more flattening out. The decline is much less than it has been at some stages in the late 70s, 80s, where the decline was very rapid of real prices. Now it's more a flat sideways move. And that's for almost all products, showing that. And next slide. Coming then specifically to the food price index, as this figure was produced with the data to the end of 2020, the real peak we have seen in the recent months of the FAO food price index is not really included. We still have an increase in 2021, but the increase would be much steeper when we would have that information. But what we see is that we consider, because of the slowing demand, growth, and continued productivity potential, we see that prices are slightly declining in real terms over the next decade. And especially now coming from high prices, this is a bit more a better indication. So we are likely to see lower real prices at the end of the next decade. Whether that's in nominal terms depends how inflation will move. Getting to the next slide. So that were straight lines, but the straight line will never happen, never. It's like you're looking at it and think, yeah, we have not seen straight lines, and so why should we have? And that's why, next slide, we worked on somehow uncertainty analysis. And to explain this a bit, what we did here is actually only incorporating variation which we observed over the last 15 years in macroeconomic conditions, which Holger explained at the beginning, which we actually take the observations from IMF, World Bank, and also partly from the OECD material. Those we used and variate what we saw over the last 15 years, the same with yields. And then we added that into the model in Ackland-Cosimo as shocks to run the model 1,000 times with different combination of those kinds of shocks to see what happens. And then you see already the fan of prices we project into the future for rice, vegetable oil, and poultry here are really much wider than what we presented before, and show also how much potential is, and that we have not stable prices even with those known uncertainties. And those shocks which were observed in very fundamental drivers. And we then, in addition, go to the next slide. Then we have also uncertainties which are not really covered, which are adding. So you have the observation that there might be shifting really in consumption patterns. There might be consumption behavior also changed, especially now with the COVID situation, that people are more aware. There were times when restaurants were closed and people went to another style of consumption. All those kinds influence consumption. You have the production side where lots of shocks can happen. You have very often disease outbreaks. You have the locust invasion in East Africa. Weather variations are coming in addition, extreme weather events. But also you have on the side, it's like more rapid incorporation of digitalization innovations, which can actually push up and be a positive change, because very often uncertainties, we are looking more to the negative side than to the positive side. And then very often policies are adding to it, or to uncertainty, knowing what are new regulations, what are new conditions. The biofuel sector very much depends on policies. So promoting biofuels or reducing the promotion can be a big swing factor in demand and production. You have lots of policies which try to gear innovations, plant breeding and so on, limit those things or encourage those elements, support on that side. On the trade side, trade agreements, trade conflicts are on the high agenda, and it's a daily element to see how those things develop. Sometimes they're pushing the possibilities forward, sometimes they're reducing again, and with the Chinese US trade conflict, we saw a movement in both directions. At once they stopped international trade, and then when they eased again, trade boosted again. So these variations are very important to observe and see, and that influence what comes out and can variate very rapidly what we presented. And that's why it's not a forecast, it's a projection, and those elements can be tested a bit in scenarios. Next slide. To summary all what we have said, and especially also Holger presented in production and consumption, is first of all, we see some progress in reducing hunger, but by no means we are getting closer to actually reach the SDG 2 to eliminate hunger. And also other nutritional problems, and I think there are rising, increasing overweight. We have oversupply of different nutrients, and which can cause problems, too much fat, too much sugar in the diets, or elements like this, which have to be addressed. And we don't see really progress on that one, but that are challenges which can be highlighted with the developments. And we have, as Holger said, an increased carbon efficiency, but still increasing emissions from agriculture. So that means there's more potential for innovation, for productivity growth, and so on, combination to actually achieve also a reduction of emissions to contribute to the commitments in the Paris Accord to reduce overall emissions. And agriculture can contribute, but with the current setting, it's not very likely. And then, of course, when we have the declining real prices, as we indicated, that put pressure on the farmer income. So farmers have to be innovative, have to be more productive on the one side, or looking into other opportunities to have an outcome with the setting of generally real prices under pressure, what we see forward. And what we need is more in investments to guide and support this sustainable productivity growth overall, and of course a fair and equitable, open, transparent and rules-based trading system to actually allow that the reliance is there. As is shown, the resilience is actually for open markets much better than for inward-orientated policies. So open markets very often help that the food systems are much more resilient, as also has been shown during the COVID pandemic, that actually helped to keep it more resilient, the system. Next slide. And with that one, we thank you. There's the link to our website, and you can contact both of us, and we are really pleased that we had the opportunity, and pleased by the FAO liaison office to organize it, and also Jirkes to host this event. and the great participation here. Thank you very much.
ドクター・ヒューベルタス、大変ありがとうございました。